Hello again, everybody. This is Derek, and I am coming back at you with another Wargaming and Miniature video. Now, in today's video, we're going to be exploring various base materials. When I say basing materials, what I'm talking about is the actual material that the base itself is made of, and not the base covering, like not the flock or grass or texture paste or anything like that. We're going to be focusing on the material that the base itself is made of. This video will be fairly comprehensive. I will show you not only round bases and square and rectangular bases, but I'm also going to show you unit bases and multi-figure bases and the different materials available for each of those types of bases, and why some, in my opinion, why some are better than others and why I use certain ones. And it'll give you kind of an understanding of my thought process, and maybe you'll learn something about these basing materials. Okay, so in the first chapter, what we're going to be talking about is 25 millimeter round bases. A lot of you play skirmish level games in 28 millimeter where you have a figure mounted on a 25 millimeter base, like, I don't know, Bolt Action, Lion Rampant, SPQR, you know, just to name a few. There's a bunch of skirmish level games where individual figures are mounted on 25 millimeter bases. Now you can mount them, some people might even mount them on like a square, but we'll be getting into squares in just a moment. So we're talking about, usually the round bases are used for games that the troops don't form close formations, like a pike phalanx or, you know, a line of riflemen or something like that. Usually they're spread out, you know, like Warhammer 40K or something like that, where they're out and they have like unit cohesion where you got to stay a certain number of inches apart or whatever. So that's usually when the round bases are used. Okay, so let's talk about basing materials. Well, I've got some Rubicon bases right here. These are made out of, I think it's a 3D resin. I'm not exactly sure, or an ABS, where this plastic, you cannot use plastic cement on that. You would need to use another form of glue, like a super glue, or like maybe even like a Gorilla Glue or something like that on these types of bases. Now this is a figure that I mounted just recently on my What's in the Bag video, and I used some super glue on that to get that figure to base. I attempted this Tamiya cement and it did not work. All right, so now we're moving on to some plastic bases that it would work. These are the Warlord Games bases that have a very small lip and are very flush with the ground, and they're smooth. They would slide around. Some people like these bases. Some people, namely myself, only use these in an emergency. There's Warlord has two styles of their 25 millimeter base, with or without a lip. One good thing about these bases, well, first of all, they're plastic, so you can use plastic cement on them. But also, if you've got a figure similar to this that only has its feet and not an actual base under it, you know, because some figures will have a built-in base of the figure, and if it doesn't have a built-in base, going on this is good, because it's completely 100% covered also on this. Alternatively, like this figure here, he's actually based on a fender washer. That's a Perry miniature. Perry miniatures come with their own base that they stand on. And one advantage of that is that if you do base it on a fender washer, the base that the figure comes on will cover that hole. I would not use a fender washer with a model like that because it would leave the hole. Now, in an emergency, sometimes I would put a piece of tape on the bottom covering the hole, and then I would fill the hole with some kind of putty or something like that. Then once you flock it and you put all your basing material on there, it would disappear, and so there would be no problem. But I would just avoid that. But if the figure comes with its own base, like a Plastic Soldier Company, an offensive miniature, a Hail Caesar model, a black powder model, you know, those guys all come with their own bases. You could easily put that on a fender washer, not have to worry about that hole being exposed. One thing that I love about fender washers are they weigh a ton. These are zinc. This you know, you get them in boxes of 100. I think the cost for this box of 100 is the same as 25 Warlord games. So you're getting 4 times as many. Same as the Rubicon. So these are 25, these are 25. You're getting, for the cost, I'm getting 4 times as many bases. And they're 1 inch, which a 1 inch base is 25 millimeters, so it's perfect. But that's not the main reason why I like the fender washers. The fender washers have a weight to them. They weigh quite a bit. So if I put a metal model onto this, it's not going to be top heavy. It's still going to be base heavy. And so it won't tip over if you put it on a hill slope or something like that. It's not going to tip over. If you were to take a very heavy model, like maybe a front rank model or something like that, and you put it on a plastic base like this, it will become top heavy. And so when you put it on any kind of hill slope or stairs or something like that, sometimes, not a lot, but sometimes the angle will be so great that the model will tip over. So I like the metal bases. Also, for transporting your models, if you have a tub, a box, or something like that that you store your figures in, you can put a magnetic sheet on, like I have some self-adhesive magnetic sheets that I can put on a drawer, and then when you put this model into your container, it'll stick to that magnet and it won't move around, damaging your model. So there's a lot of advantages for the fender washers. And I use fender washers because the hole in the center is very small. You can use an actual washer, but the hole would be way bigger. So avoid regular washers, and I recommend fender washers. Okay, this tree here is actually on a fender washer, and one of the reasons why is because it was top heavy. If I put it on any kind of light basing material, it would have tipped over with no problem. But being on a metal washer like this, it actually doesn't fall over or tip over on the table. Plus, it gives the tree some weight, some oomph. All right, so now as an alternative, we're going to skip these for now. As an alternative, you can use wooden, like right here I've got thin plywood bases. These are going to be about the same thickness as these Warlord bases. They just won't have a lip. And they're also very lightweight. So if you have, if you like lightweight bases, or if you want to get like 100 bases, again, that's a good alternative. Like for your D&D models or whatever, this is a really good alternative to get those 25 millimeter circles, because you know your D&D models use 1-inch circles as well. Okay, so this tree, because it was a lot smaller, I felt that, and it didn't come with a trunk, where this came with a trunk base that when I glued it onto the fender washer, it covered the hole. This tree did not come with a trunk base. What it came with was a wire. It's a trunk, but at the bottom of the trunk, there's only a single wire sticking out the bottom. So what I did was used a wooden base, as you can see, and I used a drill to drill a hole into the base so that this tree's wire trunk could go down into that hole. And because the tree is so small, there's no concern about it tipping over or anything like that. So these are plywood. They're not just wooden discs that you might find at Walmart or Hobby Lobby or something like that. These are actually plywood. And the reason why I like, if I'm going to go wood, the reason why I like plywood is that they don't warp. They don't, like, the edges don't curl up or bend or anything like that. And finally, there are Citadel or Games Workshop makes slaughter bases and non-slaughter bases for some of their older games, like Warhammer 40K. I don't really see them in any of their new games. They use these big round bases nowadays. But in the olden days, they would use round bases. Now, they use the slaughter bases for their metal miniatures because they would have a bar that connected their feet, and you could slide that into the slot. And when you glued it down, that metal bar that went between the feet would fill that gap. And then when you put your basing material on there, everything would be flush. And then they also had like plastic Space Marines, which did not have a bar going between their feet, and they would glue onto these solid bases. Now, these bases are like 3 millimeters thick, and they're about the same thickness, if not exactly the same thickness, as your Rubicon bases. They have no lip, where this has a lip. So when you put your basing material on this, you're building it up from the top of the base. The bases are textured, so there's actually no need to put any texture paste on these. You can just paint them and then put your flock. So there would be no need to do any kind of texturing, unless you just wanted to. And with this smooth edge, they also go down at a not, instead of going straight up and down, they go down at an angle, meaning the bottom of the base is actually wider than the top of the base, but it's so minor of a slope that it's really not noticeable unless you're looking at it. So if I'm going to go with a plastic base for a model, I'll usually go with my Warlord Games plastic with lip. And in the next few models that I put together, I'm going to be using the Rubicon. I'm going to put some metal models from Offensive Miniatures on these and see how well they disguise the big bulge. Because you can see that when you're basing, if there is no lip, this is the Warlord with no lip, you put a model that has a foot base on there, it kind of looks like he's standing on a little mound. Okay, so those are a bunch of different 25 millimeter model, 25 millimeter round bases. Favorite is fender washers, 100%. I will always use a fender washer if available. If there's a gap in their feet and there's no base, I'll try to avoid the fender washer and go with a solid base so that I don't have to worry about filling that up. All right, let's go on and take a look at some other bases. All right, so in chapter 2 here, we're going to talk about square bases, also 25 millimeter, but this would also apply to your 20 millimeter bases and larger bases, like maybe 40 millimeters or whatever. So this applies to really all your bases. But let's talk about plywood. Right now, I've got 3 pieces of plywood here, all from the same manufacturer. These are all from Litco. Now, they're not all square, but what I wanted to show was thickness. This is a 0.8 millimeter thick, which is what they call their thin bases, which are really good. And again, being plywood, it doesn't want to bend or anything. And then this is their middle thickness, which is 1.5 or 1.6. So it's basically double this. And then this is 3 millimeter, which is double that. So it just doubles as it goes up. In my opinion, well, there's uses for every one of these bases, but I pretty much have gotten away from using any thin bases. Thin bases just, or thin plywood bases, I should say, just don't, you can't grip them very well. And if you have to push them across the table, they get caught. They also overlap each other when you've got massed units together. So thin, I try to avoid. The thick bases, I try to avoid as well, because I think it just looks cartoony on the table. I think I don't like having like this really thick base on the table for your models. But if you look at like a Games Workshop plastic base, you're getting the same thickness as a 3 millimeter base. So these actually pair up very well. If you need a Slota base, Litco can make Slota bases as well, and that's what this is. This model here is an old Games Workshop orc that had a bar between his feet, and he would fit down inside of a Slota base. Now, I could have used my plastic snippers and snipped it off and glued it onto a solid base, and there wouldn't have been any kind of problem. But I thought that I would just go ahead and get a bunch of these Slota bases because I don't have a lot of these. Remember, the old Slota bases were for the old Warhammer, which they don't make anymore. So this guy is actually on a wooden slot of base. And what's good about square bases, when it comes to your 25 millimeter models, you can rank them up. So you can get a bunch of models and put them side by side, square them up, and they could be rank and file, like a Roman legion or an orc warband or something like that, other than round, which usually has them separated. Another material is metal, right? These Wargame accessories make these metal base stands. This is a 2x2 or 50 millimeter by 50 millimeter. This is a 1 inch by 1 inch. These are galvanized steel. So they're really thin and don't they have you can magnetize them onto a sheet like I was talking about with the fender washers. So you can get and Wargame bases make a lot of different sizes. They just don't make round, but they do make all kinds of rectangular and square shapes. Your miniatures will glue on these just perfectly fine. It'll take flock materials or whatever just perfectly fine. The downside is the same downside that the thin plywood has, is that this metal is about the same thickness as the thin plywood, and it makes the figure super thin. You can't grip the base when lifting. You have to grip the model, and when you grip the model, you know, over time it will damage the paint job of the model. So it's better to have something you can grab a hold of on the base. And when you're sliding, if you are doing rank and file and you're sliding your miniatures around, there's a chance that one of your bases will sneak on top of the other base, because, like it just did there, because it's not thick enough to prevent that. Where a real thick base like this, you're not going to have that. You're not going to have that sneaking on top because it's a much bigger cliff to face. I personally just don't like the super thick bases. So personally, I have compromised and went with a middle. I went with a middle because I think it's the best of both worlds. It's low to the ground, but it also is thick enough that it doesn't, it doesn't compromise the slipping, and it gives me something to grip a hold of. So I like the 1.5 millimeters. If I needed to magnetize these bases, Litco also sells magnets cut to size. So if you've got 1 inch squares and you want to put a magnet on the bottom, you can buy these 1 inch magnets, and they have a peel and stick. You just peel off the bottom and stick it on the base. In that case, these thin bases with the magnet would actually be wind-ups about 2 millimeters. So it's actually a really good thickness for bases. It's just now you're buying 2 bases and you're having to do the extra work of magnetizing. But when you put it in your they have something called flex steel, which you could put a flex steel base on the bottom of this, and would basically allow the base to stick to a magnet. And remember, if you have a magnet inside your tray, then this base would lay in the tray and it would stick firmly to it. You could always add it to these as well, or whatever you want to do. But again, you're looking at plastic, wood, metal, the main base components for your 25 millimeters. All right, now in the next chapter, I want to talk about some Flames of War style bases and kind of show you some differences in these bases and why I like certain ones and don't like certain ones. Okay, so Flames of War is a World War II game that make 15 millimeter World War II figures, but they also have a kind of a unique basing system for their game, which I've used these bases for other games because there's actually a base in between these, which is a square. It's like a 30 by 30, because this is a 30 by 50 and this is a 30 by 20, and then there's also a 30 by 30 that I don't have. But and then they also make a large base for like your large artillery pieces. Okay, but these are old school Flames of War bases. These don't have any holes. They are just solid gray plastic, and they don't make these anymore. These are classics, but they went away from the solid, and I'll explain kind of why. They've gone to these bases, which I'm glad that they decided to go with a brown color. It's just more earth tone than gray. And they have holes in these bases. And there are a number of patterns. Their patterns are not always the same. There's 12 different patterns on the medium-sized base. And one way you can tell what pattern it is, on the bottom, it'll say M for medium, 4 for how many holes there are, because some of their medium bases have 5 holes. So they got 4 and 5 on the medium base. And then it'll say point and then a number. This one, in this case, says 02. So this is pattern 2, and there's 12 patterns. This one is S2.03. So this is the third pattern for a 2-hole base. They make 3-hole bases as well. Like you can see, that is a different pattern. That is pattern 2. Okay. They also have, now, okay, we're going to get into the plugs here in just a minute. But I pulled up a base, a Flames of War base with models. The models have individual bases themselves, and when you put them in the hole, it makes the model flush with the top of the base. So there's no need to do any puttying. So it looks like their feet are flush with the ground. And you can see in this example how it's a 4-hole base. I have 3 crew members, and their individual bases are down inside their holes. But where is the 4th hole? Well, because there's only 3 crew, you can use one of these plugs to fill in one of those holes. And in this case, the hole is right here in the front, and I filled that up. Boop. So now there's 3 crew and a gun on a medium-sized base. If you want, you could always get plywood from, guess where? Litco. They make Flames of War style bases. They have those rounded edges, just like the Flames of War base. And but the downside is they don't have a hole, so your figures don't sit down inside. And in this case, you can see all the figures sticking up on their personal bases. And this is also a wooden base with infantry. Again, they're not sitting down inside, but with enough flock and texture paste or putty and a foliage, you can disguise the fact that they're not sitting down inside of a hole. Okay, alternatively, Boetta, they make these resin bases, but these resin bases come with detailing on the base itself. Like this base has a bag and a box and a barrel. This base has a barrel on its side, a box of rocks, and some other rocks on the front. And then it had these 2 holes, just like this one has 2 holes as well, just like a Flames of War base, but it just comes with additional like diorama style features. And then you could put your sniper, in this case I've got a sniper and his assistant in the base. So yeah, Boetta also makes medium-sized bases and large bases as well, if you wanted additional bases. These Boetta bases are going to be quite a bit more expensive than the Litco bases. Litco bases, you could get hundreds for the cost of like one of these, and then the actual Flames of War bases, you get like a blister of like 100 or something like that for pennies. So like maybe $7 for 100 or something like that. They come in a big blister like that, and I've considered, is it possible to use these bases for games other than Flames of War, like a warband style game? Absolutely. You know, you could move around a horde of skeletons or something on a base like this. But I think it's best suited for World War II style games, Napoleonics or something like that. I wish they made a base like this with 4 holes across and 4 holes across, because then I could use a base like this to be to have my rank and file Napoleonics on. I think that would be quite awesome, actually. All right, let's move on to the next. All right, now before we move on to my multi-basing, I did want to show you that you can actually think outside the box and use anything as a base. I like to make hedgerows or fences or walls on bases. That way I can put them on my table like wherever I want. And so I get these hobby sticks, which this is a wooden hobby stick. It's 10 millimeters wide by 6 inches long. 10 millimeters wide by 6 inches long. And then you can put whatever hedge, wall, fencing material on there that you want. And you can put it on the table, and the base, the popsicle stick, gives it a little bit of weight, so that plus it keeps your hedge and fence flat, and it keeps it from tipping over on the table, right? And this is for 15 millimeter figures, so that's why it's so small. I got these crops. This is like a flower crop. It comes as a strip. I stuck it on the another type of popsicle stick. This is a much thicker popsicle stick, one closer to 20 millimeters wide. But I was making an orchard, and I made rows of trees as an orchard, and I also made some rows of crops that I could put inside of a field, and it would look like there was a crop. But again, it's just a popsicle stick, and I love the fact that it has a rounded edge. If I made and I made some bocage on these as well. If I have two bocage, you can put them end to end like that, and there would be no problem. But what if you need to make an angle or a corner with the rounded edge? It actually works well. So I use these for my terrain, usually terrain basing. So don't mind, or don't limit yourself to just manufactured, bespoke bases. Now, one thing I don't use anymore is balsa wood. I used to use balsa and cut them into strips of either bases for figures, or bases for terrain, or bases for buildings, or whatever. And I don't do that anymore because balsa actually will warp. Specifically, once you start adding glue, if there's any kind of moisture in that glue, it'll make your base want to curl or bend. So I stopped using balsa wood here, or I don't have a building on a base. But what I usually use for buildings is a big sheet of MDF. I would get MDF at my local Lowe's or Home Depot, and they come in like 2 feet by 4 feet sheets. Sometimes 4 by 8 is whatever you want. But if you can get a 2 by 4 sheet, and then you can even cut it with a box knife or a jigsaw, or however you want to cut it, and you can cut it down to shape, and that's actually a really good basing material for terrain. So if you're building a hill, put that as the bottom of your hill. If you're doing a city or a village, cut out the shape that you need, and then glue the buildings on this. So if you're going for something larger than just a couple of inches, I recommend the MDF. And then I would take the edges and bevel them down so that you get a good piece of terrain. Like for an orchard, instead of gluing the trees into the MDF board, you can make sticks like this or similar to this, and you could have just the base with maybe grass or dirt, maybe a hedge around the outer edge, and then you can put these on top of your base, and that way when your troops are moving across the base, you can adjust and shift the trees or whatever you need to do. All right, so now let's move on to the next chapter. All right, now continuing on with the larger or multi-base theme, we're gonna kind of jump around a little bit, and I apologize for that, but let's start off by saying that Warlord Games has a traditional size for like their mortar teams, machine gun teams, uh, maybe their like heavy weapons teams or whatever. This is, I do believe, 60 millimeter circle. That's perfect. But I've gotten some larger anti-tank guns like a Pac 40 or something, or a 3-inch gun, and those guns will come with a 60 millimeter base, and or even a flak 88 will come with a base like this. And I'm telling you, these bases are not big enough to accommodate the larger guns. Smaller guns, maybe a 57 or a 37, absolutely no problem. Mortar teams, no problem. Machine gun teams, no problem. Instead of using these lipped Warlord games, you can also go with maybe plywood. This is a 3 millimeter thickness plywood that you can use. This model here is actually on a 3 millimeter thick plywood base. It's also perfectly 60 millimeters. It's perfectly fine. And then Rubicon actually makes some 60 millimeter round bases as well. You only get 5 in this pack. Well, you only get 4 on this sprue. So, cost effectively, I think these are way better cost effective. And they're thick enough and they're sturdy enough that I don't see any problem with using these on your standard gun crews. There is advantages for these because they have the extra deep lip, but it's not a big enough advantage to warrant getting one of these packs, in my opinion. But it is an option. It is available. Bigger models, like let's say an ogre or a giant or a dragon, let's say, might be top heavy, or it might be a little more precarious if you glue it to a wooden base or one of these thin plastic bases. A big advantage of the Rubicon bases are they have a number of holes, or I should say dimples, that you can pin your model to. You'd have to drill a hole using a pin vise and then put a pin in your foot of your giant to secure him. So that's a big advantage for those. Plus, the dimples also help grip your basing material so they don't want to like flake off or fall. Okay. Another way Wargame Accessories makes a variety of different square and rectangle. These are square 60 millimeter bases, not specifically for bolt action, but I could easily put an anti-tank gun or a flat gun on a square base, and being that it's metal, it's not going to be top heavy. It's going to hold weight, and you get quite a few of them in this pack, maybe 20 of them in this pack. So that's a really good deal. 60 by 60 is great for mass combat formations, for like maybe Meg, or it might be a general's base for Meg. So that's just something you can think about. Now, when you start talking about larger anti-tank guns, like a Pac 40 or a what do you call that? Like a flak gun or something like that. You need something bigger than a 60. So this guy here is 100 millimeters. So is that. Okay, so these guys are 100 millimeters, but the difference is, and 100 millimeters is actually really good for the big guns, like a 25 pounder or something like that. This is plywood. It's not 3 millimeters. It's actually just shy of 3 millimeters, maybe 2.8 or something like that. But the reason why this was not a Litco purchase, I didn't buy this at Litco. I actually bought this at Hobby Lobby. This was a 100 millimeter disc plywood that you can get in their little wood section. That's what I got this. As an alternative, you could get this, which is not even, it's MDF board. This MDF base, I don't remember exactly where I got it, but it also is very sturdy. It doesn't want to bend or anything like that. I primed it because I was going to make a large general diorama like Napoleon and stuff like that on this, and then I just wanted the bottom to be primed. So yeah, this could be used for your large anti-tank guns or giants or dragons or whatever. Also, if this is 100 millimeters, what that is actually a 4-inch base. And if you know anything about some fantasy games, 4-inch bases are actually used for like gargantuan models, like dragons and giants and stuff like that. This would be good for that as well. And then finally, when it comes to these mass bases, this is a camp size base for DBA, Field of Glory, Meg. It's 80 millimeters by 120 millimeters. Now, because of the size of it, because it's very large, I wanted to use the thicker 3 millimeter thickness to give it its extra, not durability, but to prevent it from warping or anything like that. So this would be a campsite base. But I could also put like a big anti-tank gun on there or something like that. So that's why I've gotten these. Now I'm going to put like tents and camp followers and stuff like that on my camps. But this is the size for a 15 millimeter camp. If I was going with 25 millimeter, it would be 1.5 times this size. And if that was the case, I would use, like I would do, I would go to Lowe's or Home Depot, get a sheet of MDF, and then I would cut it to size. So anything super large, I would use the MDF. Okay, and finally, this is the last thing I'm going to show. As you know, I'm doing a lot of Meg basing right now, and I'm using 40 by 20 millimeter bases. And because I'm using Litco medium thickness, which is the 1.5 millimeter thickness, which is also the 1.5 millimeter thickness is also the most expensive Litco base. The thin bases, the 0.8, and the thick bases, the 3 millimeter, are both cheaper than the 1.5. I'm a glutton for punishment, I guess. Okay, but I want that so I could have a thin base because I prefer thin bases. But when it comes to units moving around on a table in a block, I want it to be thick enough that they don't interfere with each other or they don't overlap. Old Glory 15s has something new called bulk bases. And the bulk bases are metal bases cut to shape. These are 40 by 20s. The downside is they are thin. They actually give you the extra weight you might want. Plus, you can use these as a magnetized storage. You get about 100 of these, so I think it's 96 or something like that in a bag. I think it's a really good deal if you're looking for bases. The metal, I just don't know if I want to use these, but I'm looking through the packaging and they look thicker than these bases, the metal Wargames accessories bases. I don't know what the gauge is on the metal. Plus, these bases look a lot cleaner steel-wise, where these bases look galvanized. And they are galvanized. Yeah, metal stands are galvanized for easy painting. I don't see why this wouldn't be. You just prime it, and plus you're going to texture paste it anyway. But I got them anyway. And I might even throw a couple of units. Maybe my Romans, I might put them on these. I don't know. It'll just give those units. Or maybe if I have plastic models like the plastic Romans or the plastic Greeks or plastic Carthaginians or whatever I'm using, if I use plastic models, I might put them on the metal bases because it'll give them weight. Where if I put the plastic, like I did my Greek hoplites, I put them on these bases and they are super weightless. There's something about having weight as part of your miniature that makes it pleasurable feel to it. I like the extra weight. Plus, I can put these on a magnetized tray and then I don't have to worry about them sliding around and damaging the models. All right, so let's do a real quick recap. Rubicon uses a plastic that you can't use plastic cement on. You'll have to use super glue or some other glue to affix your guys. Warlord has some thin bases for their troops with a very thin lip. There's plywood that you can get either from Litco, which is laser cut, or Hobby Lobby. There, you just have to shop around for the exact size that you need. There's MDF boards that you can get and use, and there's nothing wrong with MDF. It's actually very sturdy. There's metal, either metal Wargames accessories or Old Glory. I don't know if these are, if this is the same manufacturer, but it's packaged differently. Fender washers for your World War, well, any skirmish game that you need at 25 millimeter. And it gives the base a little bit of a weight. There are slaughter bases from either Games Workshop or Litco that you can use. You can, if you can imagine, use other materials for bases, specifically your terrain, like popsicle sticks or MDF board. Flames War bases are specifically made with patterns of holes, so you don't have to putty or make the model, you don't have to build up the edges around the models. So those are actually really good bases as well. So I hope this was very informative for you. A lot of these bases you can find on my eBay store, which you can find right there. If you're looking for any kind of work done, you can email me right there, where I will be glad to do some commission work for you. And thank you for coming out and checking out this video, and I will catch you in the next one.